This video will walk through an analysis of your selected advertisements, focusing on the placement of the camera and the gaze of the subjects in the image. Before you begin, you should have the following. First, the two handouts pictured here. One is a guide sheet for this discussion, and the other is a worksheet where you'll evaluate and respond to your 3 ads. And second, access to your 3 ads, whether in printed form or digital access using a computer. The first topic to consider is proxemics, which means the distance between the buyer, the viewer, and the focus point in the ad, the subject. Proxemics asks, how close is the person looking at the ad to the image's subject? The same rules that govern the way we perceive relationships and distance in the real world also apply to advertising. When you are very comfortable with another person, when you are closely acquainted, you feel at ease standing very near to that individual, as demonstrated in these pictures. A close-up photograph suggests high viewer-subject intimacy because we're accustomed to only being physically close to people that we know very well. In contrast, if a person is unfamiliar or a complete stranger, you will likely leave a larger physical space between you and that person because you don't have a strong relationship yet. You remain physically distant because you are emotionally distant from that unknown figure. In a similar fashion, in an advertisement, a seller positions the buyer at a specific distance from the subject to communicate messages to the buyer about their relationship to the product being sold. Remember that the subject in an ad is whatever person or object most draws your attention, whether that be an actual human being or a car or a bottle of ketchup. Just as a small distance between two people suggests they know one another very well, and a distance of an arm's length suggests a casual friendship, a camera close-up suggests the buyer is interacting intimately with the subject, while a long shot suggests observation or a distant relationship between viewer and viewed. Consider these examples. In this Miss Dior perfume ad, the seller has intentionally chosen a camera close-up. The seller wants the buyer to feel intensely engaged with the subjects. The first and most prominent subject is a beautiful actress named Natalie Portman, but the second subject is the bottle of perfume, the product itself. Her apparent state of undress, aside from a flower, intensifies this suggestion of intimacy. Her direct eye contact also suggests that the buyer has a relationship with her. The camera close-up and the subject's appearance demonstrate that the seller wants to suggest a deep, private, personal connection between this gorgeous, multi-million-dollar actress and a shopper choosing among perfumes. Sometimes close proximity is used in a different fashion. Here's an ad for Close-Up Liquifresh toothpaste that reads, "No one needs to know what you've been eating." Here, as in the perfume ad, the buyer is positioned very, very close to the subject, the man whose recent fish meal has left him with nasty breath. Here, an unpleasant, undesirable subject is put very close to the buyer to intensify the threat. If you're not using the right dental products, you might be grossing out those who you're closest to and risking public embarrassment. In comparison, here we have an ad for Jim Beam Black, bourbon whiskey, where the advertisers have chosen not a camera close-up, but instead a medium shot. This suggests a more casual relationship with the subjects, a group of men at a somewhat formal social event, one of whom cradles a glass of whiskey. Perhaps we could get closer to them, or to these kinds of classy, important friends. We could enter these refined social circles and their impressive surroundings if we drank Jim Beam Black. The medium distance between the buyer and the subject underlines the gap between where we are now and where the product can get us. Finally, this ad for Timberland outdoor gear intentionally uses a long-distance view of the subjects, a couple about to explore distant mountaintop trails. The distance between the buyer and these subjects suggests that they are strangers rather than friends. There is an invisible barrier between the viewer, the buyer, and the subjects. The subjects, these hikers in their shoes, are here for the viewer to contemplate only, out of reach, as if on display in a shop window. Long-distance views also tend to blend the subjects into the background, which is also appropriate to this image, which wants to emphasize the beautiful exotic places they promise that you can access through Timberland outdoor gear. Hopefully, these three examples, a camera close-up, a medium camera shot, and a distant camera, demonstrated the range of proximity that advertisers might use to engineer a specific buyer response to their imagery. Now, please look at your three ads and score them using the provided worksheet. If an ad places the buyer very near to the subject, give the ad a high intimacy score, like a 9 or a 10. If an ad emphasizes the distance between the buyer and the subject, give it a low intimacy score, like a 1 or a 2. If an ad falls somewhere in between, like the Jim Beam whiskey ad, then give it a score that falls in the middle and reflects that middle ground proximity. Please pause the recording now until you've had time to score the camera proximity for each of your three ads. After considering how close the buyer appears to be to the subject or subjects of an advertisement, it's useful to consider the vertical angle. That is, how high or low is the buyer in relation to the scene depicted. The seller positions the subjects at a specific height from the buyer to communicate a message to the buyer regarding power. When you look at an image, you need to ask yourself, is the camera positioned level with the subject, or looking down from above at the subject, a high angle shot, or looking up from below at the subject, a low angle shot? A level angle tends to imply neutral equality without a power difference, and encourages the viewer to relate to the subject, or personify an object if it's not human. A high angle perspective can reduce the size of the subject and make them appear weak, needing protection, inferior, unimportant, or even submissive. A low angle perspective taps into the viewer's instinctive insecurities and tends to make the represented subject look larger than life, superior, dominating, or even unobtainable. The greater the angle, the more significant the power difference between the viewer, the observer or buyer, and the subject, the thing being observed. Consider this example, an ad for McDonald's. The text says, "Remain calm, I think there's a McDonald's on the way home." The camera is positioned so that the buyer is vertically equal to the subject. A man who fears the fancy gourmet food he's been served isn't nearly as delicious as reliable McDonald's. The buyer is positioned at the same height to send the message that there are important ways in which we are equal to this subject. Even though he has an expensive suit and has to spend time at fancy overpriced restaurants, at heart the ad says, we're all the same. We all love McDonald's food more than anything else. This example is from a tech firm in Israel called Bazia. They're advertising their services, backing up and protecting digital computer files for individuals and businesses. The text says, "For memories you can't recreate, automatic PC restore." The joke is that these men have lost cherished childhood pictures in a computer malfunction, and so now they have to recreate child memories as adults. This is supposed to strike us as creepy and weird, and so the advertisers intentionally raise the camera. By shooting down from a high angle, the idea that the men are weak and ridiculous is intensified. We are given visual permission to laugh at them and their mistake. This harmonizes with the silly image of grown men sharing a bubble bath. Here, the high-angle perspective reduces the size of the subject literally and makes them feel weak, inferior, and unimportant. Here we have an advertisement for Nike that uses the other extreme. LeBron James is depicted as an emperor seated at a throne surrounded by gigantic lions and expensive draped velvet. But you notice that the camera, the buyer, is positioned very, very low to the ground. We are almost on our knees before the seat of the king. When the camera is intentionally positioned beneath the subject like this, the viewer, the buyer, is made to feel weak and submissive. In contrast, the subject, here LeBron in his sneakers, appears dominant and powerful. A low-angle perspective taps into our insecurities and makes LeBron look larger than life, dominating and superior. The advertisers selected a low-angle perspective because it perfectly parallels the relationship they want to establish between an ordinary ho-hum customer and the crown prince of basketball. Now, please look at your 3 ads and score them using the provided worksheet. If your ad places the buyer vertically beneath the subject, looking up like in the LeBron image, give the ad a score that indicates a low angle and a buyer intended to feel submissive or weak, a 0, 1, or 2. If your ad emphasizes the balanced equality, by placing the buyer and the subject at the same vertical level, mark it as a level angle example with a score of a 4, 5, or 6. If your ad features a raised camera that gives the buyer a feeling of superiority or power, mark it as a high angle example with an 8, 9, or 10. Remember, the greater the angle, the more significant the power difference between the observer, the viewer, the buyer, and the subject, the thing or person being observed. Please pause the recording now until you've had time to score the vertical angle for each of your 3 ads. Now that we've talked about proximity, how close the buyer is to the subject, and vertical angle, how high or low the buyer is in comparison to the subject, let's look at horizontal angle. The seller positions the subjects at a specific horizontal angle to communicate a message regarding the viewer's level of involvement. Is the camera looking at the pictured subject head-on from a frontal angle? Or is the camera looking at the pictured subject from the side, an oblique angle? The frontal angle communicates that the viewer is involved with and should identify with the subject. It says, what you see here is part of your world, something you are involved with. The oblique side angle communicates that the viewer is detached from the subject. The subject is an other to the viewer. The oblique angle says, what you see here is not part of your world. It is their world, something you are not involved with. Often the positioning of different individuals at different horizontal angles within the ad helps the viewer understand which character they are supposed to relate to. The more oblique the angle, the greater the level of detachment. Rear view shots often suggest turning away from the everyday world in order to marvel at the spectacle of nature, pursue ambitious dreams, or escape to an alternate reality. Here are 2 ads that both feature a front view shot. One is for the Boy Scouts of America and reads, "Be one with the wild," and the other is for a bar called the Local Tap House and reads, "Are you a local? The home of better beer." The horizontal angle in both images is frontal. This is an intentional design choice. The advertisers want you to identify closely with the subjects in the ad and want to be part of their worlds. Even if you're not a mud-covered youngster or a heavily bearded hipster, these brands want to feel accessible and available, so they have a frontal horizontal angle. This is an ad for an anti-smoking campaign from Truth.com. The message is, "You fade away with every puff." Here the horizontal angle is much more oblique. The image is taken from the side, and this is on purpose. Here the message is that you, the buyer, are importantly different from this person who has become addicted to smoking. You are not them. You are not like them. The campaign wants to convince the buyer, or supporter in this case, that they are different from the type of person that becomes a lifelong smoker. The oblique or side angle makes the ad about observing someone rather than being like them. Here's another example of that oblique idea. This time the product is Gain washing detergent with Febreze odor eliminator. The campaign is called "Your Clothes Were Never There" and promises that even your workout clothes with this detergent will smell as if you'd never worn them to the gym. Once again, the horizontal angle is intentional and engineered. Most customers don't want to imagine themselves as an overweight man who arrived naked at the crowded local gym. So the oblique or side horizontal angle gives us permission to think of him as something other, rather than someone like ourselves. If we use the product, we'll get the benefits, but we won't find ourselves in this ridiculous situation. Once again, we're given permission to laugh at someone and still buy the product because of the carefully chosen horizontal angle. Here's an example of the extreme opposite of the frontal horizontal angle. This is an advertisement for Nike, which uses an image of sprinter Ashley Nelson dashing away from the camera at top speed. There is a specific message sent by showing Ashley from the back rather than the front or side. A rear view of a subject captures the idea that the subject escapes the buyer's everyday world and its limitations. Ashley Nelson's abilities as a runner are far beyond what most normal people, or even athletes, can approach. This ad suggests that Nike athletic gear can help you go beyond your limitations or the limitations even of the normal world, just as this superstar athlete does. So the rear view harmonizes with the intended message of the ad. Here's another example of that phenomenon. This is for an Australian beer called Shiner Bock beer. The message says, "You get just as many Tuesdays as Saturdays." Once again, the subject is shown from a rear view because the product is promising an escape, an outlet from the normal drudgery of your everyday job and life, and the promise of something new and exciting and refreshing. Now, please look at your 3 ads and score them using the provided worksheet. If your ad depicts a subject from a rear view angle, score it as one that promises an escape from the buyer's world at a 0, 1, or 2. If your ad depicts a subject from an oblique horizontal angle, that is, from the side, score it as one that encourages you to view the subject in the ad as other, importantly different than the buyer, as a 4, 5, or 6. If your ad features a subject with a frontal horizontal angle, picture looking directly at the buyer, then score it as an 8, 9, or 10. These ads are engineered to make buyers strongly identify with the image subject. Please pause the recording now until you've had an opportunity to score the horizontal angle for each of your ads. After discussing proxemics, vertical angle, and horizontal angle, we come at last to gaze. Subjects in photographs either look at the camera, viewer, or do not. The seller uses the position of the subject's eyes to communicate a message regarding the viewer's expected response. In demand pictures, a subject looks directly at the camera, and the viewer, the you, emphasizing the subject's power and confidence. This creates an imaginary relationship with the viewer, a connection, and allows the subject to demand that the viewer respond. The viewer is asked to acknowledge the subject, enter into a relationship, or participate in the action. The kind of response the image demands depends on the subject's facial expression, posture, and the setting. A sad expression, for instance, may demand pity. In this example for Michelob beer, the direct eye contact from the young woman at the bar makes a demand that is echoed in the ad's text. Send over a beer that is less likely to get sent back. The assumed male buyer is commanded to buy that woman a beer, and that command is underlined by the direct eye contact. In offer pictures, the subjects are not looking at the viewer. Instead, the photograph subjects are offered to the readers as though they were specimens in a display case and are unaware of being viewed. The subject is there to be considered rather than obeyed. The viewer is a detached onlooker, an audience member studying unfamiliar participants. The artist designing the ad is speaking to the viewer and proving the product's merit rather than a character inside the image. In images without direct eye contact, the gaze of the subjects can still direct the viewer's attention in important ways. In this ad for Rave Hair Gel, none of the subjects are making direct eye contact with the buyer. The ad is not demanding that we do something, so there is no direct eye contact. Instead, it is offering the example of the young man who uses Rave Hair Gel and thus looks fantastic even in a convertible on a windy day. We infer that we might want to consider making the same choice, but there is no explicit demand. Now, please evaluate the eye contact in your images and to what extent each uses direct eye contact to suggest a demand of the viewer. Remember that if your ad doesn't feature a human face, you may have to approximate in whatever creative way you can whether or not direct eye contact is suggested. If the ad features direct, clear eye contact, like the Michelob image, mark it as an 8, 9, or 10, suggesting a strong demand made of the viewer. If the ad features virtually no eye contact, like the Rave Hair Gel ad, mark it as a 0, 1, or 2, suggesting that it is about offering something to the buyer or viewer rather than demanding a specific response. And if the ad features a mix of the two options or some in-between blend, mark it accordingly. When you've completed that aspect of the worksheet, you've completed this video and this activity.